So today we're going to take a look at push for peace. Now I have a number of little things that I want to sort of get to, but the main crux of what I'm talking about today will be this push for peace in the Middle East, particularly the push for peace between Israel and the Palestinians, which the whole world now says is sort of, this is the hub. If we can solve this problem, everything else in terms of peace will fall in place. That has enormous prophetic implications, and there was more talk about pushing for that this week. And we'll talk a little bit about that. First of all, we're going to talk about some of the different signs that we talk about, such as the convergence of all these things that happen. We talk about the Jews, apparently in Matthew chapter 24, when the abomination of desolation takes place, to escape to Petra. We talk about things about the seven-sealed scroll that opens, Jerusalem being a cup of trembling. But all of these things right now are in play. Now, they're not in their full manifestation. These things will unfold over a period of time and reach an ultimate climax at the return of Jesus Christ. But bits and pieces of them will start to fall into place. And when they do, it'll seem like, as somebody says, the world's not falling apart, it's falling into place. And that's exactly what happens. But it's very disconcerting to sit and watch and see all these things happen. It can get very distressful when you see a lot of these things come together. So we'll talk a little bit more about where some of these events might fit, but just some updates. First, we're going to do a little economic update. In the United States, which still remains the world's, depending on how you calculate it, the world's largest economy, we have a growing problem with student debt. Right now, you see in the lower right-hand corner, there's $85 billion past due in student debt. That's not the total amount of student debt, though. The total amount of student debt is over $1 trillion. And you see the 511% up there? That is the student loan debt has grown 511% since 1999. I can assure you that that exceeds all of the best stock picker in the world has not had a 511% return since 1999. The typical borrower now owes between $10,000 and $50,000 for their education. And then this is a chart that breaks down how that is going. 14.4% are now past due on their student loan accounts. And these are young people who are having increasingly more difficult time getting good paying jobs because of the way the economy is going. So what this article did was it took the growth in student debt and it compared it to other markers. So for example, the total student debt by 2020 is projected to be $3.5 trillion. You can see in 2010, it was around 500 billion. In 10 years, 500 billion to 3.5 trillion. So they compare it like total credit card debt in the United States is, as of 2011, was 562 billion. In the United Kingdom, their national debt is 1.76 trillion. So our student debt in the United States will exceed the total national debt of the United Kingdom by a factor of 2 by 2020. The total GDP of Russia is 1.48 trillion in 2015. Again, student debt will be over 2 times that amount. Does anybody think that that is a sustainable path? What you also find is that student debt is growing at the rate of 17% per year. At that rate, if it does not change, by 2030, and everybody keeps using this 2030 date, there's the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN wants to have everything in place to make a perfect world by 2030. That's their goal. And a lot of governments of the world, to be honest with you, or not to be honest with you, but to be frank with you, are buying into that program. Whatever it takes, we're going to make a perfect world. We're going to build the perfect human being. We're going to do all of this by 2030. And my question is, how are they doing so far? Really? Talk about a little bit more about that in a minute. But if it does not change, student debt in the United States will total $16 trillion, over $16 trillion by 2030. That's more than the current national debt. My suggestion to you is that is not sustainable. It can't continue. And it's not going to get, do you think college costs? I think one presidential candidate at least is saying that there should be free education, never have to pay for it. And of course, whenever anybody asks him, well, how are you going to pay for it? What's his answer? What's your next question? Right. He never answers the question. Other things that are going on too in the economy, central banks continue to do some things that are really not precedented. The Bank of Japan, for example, and a number of other central banks, like the Eurozone, Denmark, and Sweden, have actually started paying negative policy rates, negative interest rates. That, in effect, is, I won't go into all the details of it because, frankly, I don't understand it. It's essentially a tax. But what it's doing is, for example, the Bank of Japan said they're going to move their interest rate, their core interest rate, into negative territory this year, or immediately. What will happen? Well, investors will see. My audio? Okay. The investors will see that. They will see those negative interest rates, and they'll know that those negative interest rates are going to translate into essentially a tax on their savings and savings accounts. Because, I mean, who wants to put your money in the bank and pay the bank the privilege of having your money in the bank? So what is that going to do? It's going to create capital outflows. In part, I think it's being done to prop up stock markets, which are collapsing and falling. So people will take their money out of banks and put it into stocks in the hope that the stocks will continue to go up. But when they take the money out of the banks, what happens to the banks? They don't have money to loan to other people, and the credit system starts to collapse. And so there's a snowball effect. And how this all plays out, I don't know. It's just that at some point, it appears that we're going to have some economic bumps in the world. I just don't think that it's avoidable at this point. I know this is hard for people to get sympathy for, hard times for U.S. luxury home sales. I saw that the estate of Robin Williams sold his home in Napa that he had built about 10 years ago. It was on the market originally for $35 million, and I think it sold for $16 million. I know, boohoo, right? But that's an indicator of what's going to happen in the rest of the economy with housing, because luxury home prices, for example, in London, which has just been an insane market where some houses are going for 50 to 100 million pounds, it's finally started to slow down. It's in fact, prices have started to drop. So suffice it to say, there's an economic storm ahead. Exactly how it plays out, if I had it figured out, trust me, I'd be phoning this in from Costa Rica or an island in the Caribbean or something. And I'm not, so obviously don't have it figured out. I want to talk just a little bit about this Zika virus. There's a lot of controversy. Is it really the cause of this huge spike in cases of microencephaly, small heads in babies, particularly born in Brazil, all across Brazil and South and Central America? The public health authorities have told women, you should delay having a baby for 2 years or more until we get a handle on this. Now, that has a huge economic impact down the road too, assuming we're all around here for a while longer. And now that's showing up, and there's a few confirmed cases in the United States. There's a lot of talk about, do we need vaccines for it? And I know there's a lot of people that are concerned about vaccines, and this is just a conspiracy by Big Pharma to make something up so they can make a lot of money selling vaccines. But then again, it may be a real problem. So the question is, how do you know what to do? There is also some discussion about the fact that the outbreak appears to be centered in an area of Brazil, at least where it started, where they had released a large number of genetically modified mosquitoes. The mosquitoes were released there to help with the new fever and yellow fever, because that's a problem. So they, I guess, created a disease-resistant mosquito that would not pass on those particular diseases, but now maybe it's passing on this Zika virus, which has been around and existing. So, what people try to do for good sometimes backfires. And I think this is going to be a problem as we go forward, because we see, when I played you clips of people at Davos last week where they got together and they talked about how they're going to make this perfect human. We're going to build the perfect human. We don't even know. And these are not crazy, irrational people. These are people who have totally bought into this program, that we're going to make human beings into something that they've never been. We're going to make them essentially into immortal gods. A few years ago, Time Magazine had a cover. I have it in my convergence slide each week. 2045, the year man becomes immortal. That was a cover of Time Magazine 3 years ago. This stuff has gone mainstream. But the question is man going to build the perfect human? Has there been an incident in the past, like, say, the Tower of Babel, where people thought that they could become as gods, as God? And what happened? God intervened. And so I think when we get to a certain point, God will intervene again here. And that's an interesting convergence point, is that man's messing around in things that man is not God. There are a lot of smart people out there, but they're human. You went to high school with a lot of them, and they can be idiots in a big part of their life. So the fact that they think they're going to engineer a human being is a crazy idea. And I'm all for medical technology. I've got a few artificial joints myself, so I'm all for that. But there's a point at which, a tipping point at which it gets passed. One of those tipping points is this. One of my favorite authors, next to Caroline Glick, is another Jewish lady from England named Melanie Phillips. She writes with particular clarity and directness, very similar to Caroline Glick. You can read her articles in The Spectator, the Times of London, and also in the Jerusalem Post. Just look at, she has a Facebook page. You can like that and you'll be updated. She has an article in the new issue of The Spectator called "It's Dangerous and Wrong to Tell All Children They're Gender Fluid." Now, this is real Days of Lot type stuff. Remember, Jesus said one of the patterns, one of the characteristics of the end times, it would be like the days of Lot. And we know what was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah with sexual perversion, among other things. But that will be a pattern of the end times. So here's some things that Melanie Phillips says in her article. Once upon a time, binary was a mathematical term. Now it is an insult on a par with racist, sexist, or homophobic to deploy it as a weapon in our culture wars. The enemy on this particular battleground is anyone who maintains that there are men and there are women, and that the difference between them is fundamental. Now, that seems to be, why are people arguing about that? But that is the culture that we live in, the days of Lot. That's why they have these laws about transgender people using the bathrooms and locker rooms and all these things. And it's not, we're way past the tipping point. It's, how many holes in the dike can you fill up with your limbs? We're to the point where the dike's going to break, I'm afraid. I just don't see it turning back. It's theoretically possible that there could be a great worldwide revival, but I just don't see it. I just don't see the promise in Scripture until the end comes. I'm sorry. So she goes on. So binary, if you say they're men and women and they're different, oh my goodness, you're a racist, a bigot, sexist, homophobic. This binary distinction, she says, is accepted as a given by the vast majority of the human race. No matter. It is now being categorized as a form of bigotry. Utterly bizarre. Scoff at your peril. It's fast becoming an enforceable orthodoxy with children and young people, particularly in the frame for attitude reassignment. And every survey that I see of opinions and beliefs of younger people is frightening. The schools, whoever was behind the agenda to get this adopted by everybody has done a great job. And the church, in many respects, we've lost out. We think we can take the kid for 1 or 2 hours a week and undo the damage that a lot of the schools inflict on them for many, many hours every day. Many didn't know whether to be amused or bemused when the feminist ideologue Germaine Greer was attacked by other progressives for claiming that transgender men who became women after medical treatment were still men. What started as a baffling skirmish on the wilder shores of victim culture has now turned into something more menacing. In short, the political class is obsessed by gender issues. I trust you are too. Surely you can reel off the differences between trans, intersex, polygender, asexual, gender neutral, and genderqueer. Do keep up. We're all gender fluid now. No, gender is not fluid. What is fluid, however, is the language. The notion that gender can be deconstructed in accordance with an ideology started in the 1970s when, ironically, in view of the Greer row now, it was promoted by feminists for whom gender was not a biological fact but a social construct. But it's not. Gender derives from a complex relationship between biological sex and behavior, and nature and nurture are not easily separable. Some unfortunates feel they are trapped in the wrong gender. Surgery may or may not resolve this confusion. Many who change sex still don't feel comfortable. Tragically, even some even commit suicide, and that's true. Johns Hopkins, which started gender reassignment surgery, has stopped because it doesn't work. Because the people at the end, even though they have maybe a little bit more of appearance of being female now instead of male when they started, they're still male. And all the attempts to change that are not, they don't accomplish things. And what they were finding was there was a lot of people still committing suicide because they couldn't get comfortable with who they now were, even though when they started they weren't comfortable with who they were. So it's a huge problem. And now what we're doing is what was a smaller problem and maybe contained, now we're just saying, you know, it's all up for grabs whether you're male or female, we tell young kids. Somebody handed me a book today about, you know, my family has 2 mommies that they distribute in grade schools. And so what does this do to kids? Now, this week in Chicago, there was an interesting conference called the Creating Change Conference in Chicago. And it was a meeting of LGBTQ and whatever other things they want to call it. It was called Creating Change. There was a reception there, though. And this is interesting. When you have a convergence of, if I can say it without being, well, I do mean to be pejorative, so I'm going to say it anyway. When you have a convergence of nutty ideas on the left, what do? Well, what do you mean? Well, a group called A Wider Bridge had a reception scheduled for the conference. They had a room set aside, and the organizers of the conference said, no, you can't meet. Now, what was A Wider Bridge's sin? I mean, in a conference where everything is celebrated as okay, and who are you to judge, and we should be tolerant of everything, what possible thing could A Wider Bridge have been advocating that was unacceptable? You want to know? They're Jews. It's a LGBTQ group from Israel who came there to say what they're doing in Israel. But because they're from Israel, that violates another tenet of the left, which is Israel is the cause of the world's problems. And so that led to this incident in the hallway outside where They eventually let Wider Bridge come back. Because Wider Bridge called them and said, wait a minute, I thought you guys were tolerant. And so now there's this problem. So now I want to show you what happened at this LGBTQ convention when Wider Bridge, the Israeli group, went ahead and held their thing. This is the protest that took place. Okay.
From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Hey, occupation has got to come. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. No justice, no peace. Shame on you. Shame on you. Free, free Palestine.
And what happened was that Jewish people who were going into the Wider Bridge meeting that had their yarmulke on, they were attacked. They were beat, they were pushed around. So at the Great Tolerant Conference, who got attacked? Jews. And what was this week? Holocaust Remembrance Day, International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And so here were these people saying, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Question. What is going to happen to them if it is Palestine from the river to the sea? They will be executed. And so this is why I say the nutty ideas of the left converge, and it's kind of fun to watch, but it's incoherent. But these people running around saying occupation, stop the occupation, it must stop now, this is a picture of Romans chapter 1. They've lost the ability to reason. So here was a comment about this. Thayer rejected the comments that Kalman Mir made after the protest. The victimhood at this event being claimed by the open house representatives is also disingenuous, Thayer told The Blade. The event they chose to attend was hosted by a Wider Bridge. A Wider Bridge is notorious for frequently partnering with the Israeli government, including its most violent right-wing racist elements, to promote media favorable to Israel. In the LGBTQ context, that's pinkwashing, using LGBTQ community as a political cover for the daily violence of the Israeli state and the theft and violence of settlers and other far-right elements. So that was the attempt at explaining the inexplicable that didn't work. In England, here's another example of sort of Chrislam gone wild. This interfaith dialogue that we're going to have, they're saying, look, you want to reach Muslims, grow a beard. That'll make you more attractive to them. Now, does anybody really think that that's going to ultimately work? Here's an article in the Huffington Post wrote by a young man, says why a Christian can view Muhammad as a prophet. Listen to one of the comments, paragraphs in his thing. As an advocate of interfaith dialogue, particularly between Christians and Muslims, I'm often faced with the issue of conversion. People ask me, if you admire Prophet Muhammad so much, why don't you convert to Islam? Why don't you accept him as the seal? I see these questions popping up on my Twitter and Facebook feeds more than you might imagine. I'm writing this to explain this piece to explain why I disagree with the idea that Christians can't recognize Muhammad as a prophet. Really, what is in question here is the definition of a prophet. Prophet can be defined as a person regarded, and this person claims to be a Christian, a person regarded as an inspired teacher or proclaimer of the will of God. Outside of the dictionary, I've always understood prophet to mean a messenger of a higher power who works on earth to bring justice and peace to humanity. And this is part of the problem, is that people do not understand the differences between Islam and other religions, even such as Christianity. Islam is a very dualistic religion. Is it a religion of peace? Yes. Is it also a religion of jihad? Yes. Is it religion that has love in it? Yes. Is it a religion that does not have love? Well, yes, of course it does not. And so this dualistic nature, look, I don't have time to go into it here, but I would highly recommend, highly recommend that you go to Political Islam Bill Warner's website, and he has some tremendous videos on there that will help you understand the nature of Islam. For example, Bill Warner, I heard an interview with him this week. He will say things like, Muhammad really was one of the greatest warriors in history. And he was. I mean, from almost complete defeat, within 10 years, he controlled the Arabian Peninsula. Within 100 years, they were knocking on the doors of Paris because they followed the example of Muhammad and how he was a warrior. But our political class, they want to ignore that as if that does not exist. And they really don't understand. So Bill Warner does great work, and I'd highly recommend it. Here's another example of things. EU officials find that most of the refugees are not refugees. This also is an article in The Spectator this week. Even EU officials are now finally admitting that a lot, or rather most, of the people we have been calling refugees are not refugees. They are economic migrants with no more right to be called European citizens than anybody else in the world. Even Franz Timmermans, vice president of the European Commission, made this point this week. In his accounting, at least 60% of the people who are here are economic migrants who should not be here, are from North African states such as Morocco and Tunisia. Swedish officials are coming to a similar conclusion, saying that as many of 80,000 of the mainly young men who have gone to Sweden as refugees in the past year alone are no such thing. Now there are the usual attempts to crowd please from certain politicians and officials who are talking about how they might have to deport these people. But they won't, will they? Does anybody honestly believe that the Swedish authorities are currently preparing to deport 80,000 fake asylum seekers from their country? And so the numbers coming in will increase, and the politicians will keep posing, and the European peoples will rightly get more and more enraged at the fact that their continent is being taken away from them. Eventually, perhaps, even the constant boogeyman of the right, of warnings about the far right, will lose their capacity to scare. Not good times ahead, I'd say. I also wanted to update a little bit on the situation in the Islamic State, really in Syria. This is a map that shows the Russian air attacks. The red ones are attacks, what they would call low confidence airstrikes. In other words, they don't, the Institute for the Study of War, you can find it at understandingwar.org, does not have good data as to whether the ones in red were actually Russian-led airstrikes. They're essentially based on reports on the ground. But one of the things that's interesting is that you'll find that most of the strikes are where? They're in the eastern province of Syria, over towards, or the western province of Syria, over towards the Mediterranean. And that really, some of the reports that I've been reading say that Russia's real goal is to create sort of divide up Syria, let the Islamic State have its section in the middle, as long as they get to control the Damascus to Aleppo and over to the coast area. Because what they really want is a warm water port. They also want another air base, and that's another thing that's sort of there. In looking at Russia, the Institute for the Study of War noted a number of things, and you can see on the map there's the little yellow numbers. Number 6 is this, and this is kind of related to the economy. It's dated January 15th. Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev announced that Russia would carry out budget cuts due to collapsing oil prices. Russian Finance Minister Anton Sulanov said that Moscow would not cut the defense budget for now, but suggested that the possibility could be re-examined if the economic crisis significantly worsened. So Russia's in a very precarious economic state. And for that reason, part of this is they're looking to expand into the Middle East. And it appears that an alliance is forming between Iran and Russia to control the flow of oil out of the Middle East. That brings a lot of things into play. We know that Israel has the largest gas find of the last 20 years off the coast in the Mediterranean. They also have shale oil that's been discovered, not sure the extent of which, but it's long been known. I've seen some old CIA reports it's long been believed that there's shale oil underneath the Golan Heights. So does Syria and Russia want the oil under the Golan Heights? Well, is that the prize that draws Russia and this alliance of other countries into Israel in the last days? It may be. We'll just have to watch and see. The other thing that you see here is Turkey is upset, just reported late last week. Turkish President Erdogan stated he would not allow Russia to establish an air base in northern Syria amid reports that Russia deployed a contingent of military personnel to an Assad regime-controlled airfield in the northwestern province of Hasaka near the Turkish border. So it's just an interesting thing. We don't hear a lot about it on the news, but there's still a lot of things going on this week. I mean, from my perspective, someone who watches the news, this week was a fairly light news week as they go. Another thing that happened this week was this meeting between Netanyahu, the head of Syria, the Cypriot government from Cyprus, and Tsipras, the head of the government of Greece. I know a lot of people think that Tsipras is a candidate for that coming man of sin, the son of perdition. I'm not that impressed by it yet. We'll have to see how it plays out. I just don't see it. Right now, I just don't see in the near term a Greek rising to world power. But we'll see. Another thing going on the border of Israel, and this is going to lead into the part that I want to talk about, this push for peace. The Israeli Defense Forces are saying that the Islamic State is now going to turn its attention to Israel. In a briefing, Hezbollah was deemed a key threat, though it is unlikely to get much funding from Iran. Hamas said preparing next war, more terror at settlements feared. In other words, they've had that lady who was stabbed a week ago. Another lady was stabbed and was killed this week in Israel. They think that that's going to happen. Now, what's happened, though, is that Russia has let Hezbollah into Dara. So let's look at where Dara is. You see the blue area right there to the right of Israel? That's the Sea of Galilee. We all know about that from the Bible stories. If you look over here to the right, you see Dara in southern Syria. It is from the southern edge of the Sea of Galilee to Dara is about 30 miles. So these things are pretty close. So when they talk about these things, so like when you're up on the Golan looking to Damascus, you're 35 miles from the center of the city of Damascus. You're probably, assuming there were roads that could take you, you're an hour drive from Beirut on the Mediterranean. So this is a very compact area where a lot of different things are going on. You've got Russian troops there, Syrian rebels, you got European and Americans sort of in the mix, you've got the Islamic State and that type of thing. But what Russia has done now is they've allowed Hezbollah to go down into Dara. And I've told this story a few times. Back in March of 2011, we were in Israel. We were staying at a resort right on the southern, they call it a resort. I don't know if that's an Israeli term for very short beds, okay? Because my knees were literally hanging over the bottom part. So I could, if I pulled my covers up to get, my legs were uncovered. It was a very frustrating couple nights for me. I know I'm suffering. I appreciate your laughter of concern there. But Dara, that morning that we got up to leave to go south down towards Beit Shan and Masada, they were announcing that the news report said there are riots in Dara. That was the beginning of the Syrian civil war. 30 miles away from where we were, they were starting the civil war that still has now claimed probably over 300,000 lives and completely destroyed a country. The pictures are devastating. So now Hezbollah has been allowed into Dara. There's a belief that they may move into Jordan. There are massive refugee camps there along the Jordan-Syrian border. So we just have to wait and see what's going to happen. Okay, now I want to talk about, for the rest of the time, this push for peace in the Middle East. Because with some of the things that I've been talking about recently, I want to set the context first of what's going on and why it might be prophetically significant. And I do think it is prophetically significant. Now, this week, on the 27th, was Holocaust Remembrance Day. I didn't have time. I was going to, but I was actually in D.C. that day. I was trying to go over to the Holocaust Memorial, but I just didn't have time to make it over there. But the day before in New York, the Secretary General of the United States, and I want you to put in context, on Wednesday is International Holocaust Memorial Day. On Tuesday, the 26th, Ban Ki-moon makes the following statement about the situation in the Middle East. I want you to listen to what he said. Listen carefully. It's a little difficult to understand because of his accent, but I think you'll be able to hear it. So you might bump the sound up back there. Okay, so here he is. He's there on the left. He's going to speak. By the way, Dry Bones in the Jerusalem Post had this summary, which I think is pretty accurate. The good news is that the head of the UN finally spoke out about Arab stabbing attacks on Jews. The bad news, he said it was the human thing to do. Here's what he said.
Sadly, 2016 has begun much like 2015 ended, with unacceptable levels of violence and a polarized public discourse across the spectrum in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. Stabbings, vehicle attacks, and shootings by Palestinians targeting Israeli civilians, all of which I condemn, and clashes between Palestinians and Israeli security forces have continued to claim lives. But security measures alone will not stop the violence. They cannot address the profound sense of alienation and despair driving some Palestinians, especially young people. The full force of the law must be brought to bear on all those committing crimes, with a system of justice applied equally for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Palestinian frustration is growing under the weight of a half-century of occupation and the paralysis of the peace process. Some have taken me to task for pointing out this indisputable truth. Yet, as oppressed peoples have demonstrated throughout the ages, it is a human nature to react to occupation, which often serves as a potent incubator of hate and extremism. So-called facts on the ground in the occupied West Bank are steadily chipping away the viability of a Palestinian state and the ability of Palestinian people to live in dignity.
And so he's saying is, well, I condemn what the Palestinians are doing, stabbing people in their homes, but it's understandable. It's human nature because they're under occupation. Now, look, there's a way to end the occupation. It's been there for 50 years. They just haven't done it. What have they done? They've made it worse. What do they teach their kids in the schools over there? They teach them stabbings, okay? You've seen the videos that I've played here of the little kids stab, stab, stab with a knife. 4-year-old kids. That's what they're being taught. So he went on to talk a little bit about, okay, what's the ultimate solution to all of this? Now, I want you to see how he ties peace between Israel and Palestine to other things.
Progress towards peace requires a freeze of Israel's settlement enterprise. Continued settlement activities are an affront to the Palestinian people and to the international community. They rightly raise fundamental questions about Israel's commitment to a two-state solution. Some may say the current volatility across the region makes it too risky to seek peace. I say the greater peril is not seeking a solution to the Palestinian question. Some say the two sides are entrenched in their respective positions. I say that we must not succumb to passivity, resignation, or hopelessness, that the comprehensive resolution of the conflict is not achievable. A lasting agreement will require difficult compromises by both the Israeli and Palestinian leaders. Yes, but what are the alternatives? The continuing deadly wave of terror attacks and killings, the possible financial collapse of the Palestinian government, ever greater isolation of the Israeli government, a further deterioration of humanitarian conditions in Gaza, and the agonizing build-up to another terrible war, a hollowing of the moral foundation of both Israeli and Palestinian societies alike, a creeping moral blindness that ignores the suffering and indeed the humanity of one's neighbor, more unilateral acts by each side intentionally designed to preempt negotiations and provoke the other side. The parties must act, and act now, to prevent the two-state solution from slipping away forever. Unfolding and implementing this vision, two states living side by side in peace and security, offers the only means by which Israel could retain both its Jewish majority and democratic status. As the wider Middle East continues to be gripped by a relentless wave of extremist terror, Israelis and Palestinians have an opportunity to restore hope to a region torn apart by intolerance and cruelty. I urge them to accept this historic challenge in the mutual interest of peace.
Well, so that's the head of the UN. His term ends later this year, December 31st, 2016. And we've talked a little bit about, there's talk about maybe President Obama becoming head of the UN. What I want you to put in context, though, from the prophetic standpoint, and by the way, it's being reported in a number of different quarters, and to be honest with you, I don't put anything past the president at this point as to what he's going to do or what he's going to want to do. But the important thing to know is that while the UN doesn't have vast power, it does have vast support from countries around the world. And there is this constant refrain from them about pushing for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And there is this belief among the governing bodies of the world that this will solve all of the world's war problems, which are huge right now. We have more refugees than at any other point in history in terms of numbers. There is a push for peace. That's my point. We know that in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, it says that this coming world leader will confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Now, look, whether you think this will work or not, the scripture tells us there will be an attempt at a peaceful solution there. Now, will it be the two-state solution that we've talked about? Oslo's been in place since 1993. I've played pictures for you, the 3,000 people on the lawn of the White House with all the leaders of the world there to witness the handshake between Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin and the signing of the Oslo Accords. There's been this constant push to reconstitute Oslo in any number of circumstances. Are we getting to the point where this will be pushed upon the Israelis, upon Israel? And I think we're getting to that point. Now, maybe Ban Ki-moon doesn't have the political charisma to pull it off, but maybe the next head of the UN will. It's possible. Has he achieved almost everything that he wanted to achieve on his agenda here? You know who I'm talking about, the president. He has. So don't dismiss him as a total as totally a non-player in this. He may very well be. I'm not saying dogmatically that he will be. I'm just saying is, what I'm seeing though is on a worldwide level, when things, and I'm telling you, and while Ban Ki-moon in his talk there, his 12-minute talk, did mention some other areas like Lebanon, he really focused on the issue is Israel and Palestine. I've also showed you passages in Ezekiel chapter 35 and 36 that talk about people who occupy the mountains of Israel, what we would know today as biblical Judea and Samaria, or what's really the West Bank. That there will be a people there that will be haughty and proud and say, look, we took this over, we're in charge. And it appears to me that at least there's a temporary two-state solution. And look, Israel is being isolated. Russia has put missiles into Syria that effectively take down Israeli air superiority over that part of the Middle East. They're being shoved against the wall. Even their tolerant, wider bridge group goes to a conference and they don't get anywhere. Why? Because they're Jews. Because they haven't solved the Palestinian problem. I'm just saying that there is a tremendous push upon Israel to do something exactly like this. Enter into this peace agreement. We know that that peace agreement will start the 70th week of Daniel. That period of time divided into two halves. And there may be peace for a time during that period. Now, there'll be a lot of other stuff going on, but we know that, in fact, in Isaiah chapter 28, it tells what's the end result of this agreement that's reached. Well, is Isaiah chapter 28, verse 14, wherefore hear the word of the Lord, you scornful men, that rule this people which is in Jerusalem. Because ye have said, by the way, did Israel have anybody ruling from Jerusalem in 1945? There wasn't even an Israel then. 67, they got Jerusalem back. It says this, because ye have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with hell are we in agreement. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come unto us, for we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood have we hid ourselves. It says that covenant, on the surface it will appear that everything's great, but underneath it's a covenant with death and hell. So at the beginning, looks okay, we're at peace, everything seems fine. And people need to warn Israel at that time, don't get comfortable. Don't be misled that this is really a good thing, because ultimately a lot of things are going to happen and all hell's going to break loose. Jesus talked about it at the middle of the 70th week, where he says this, when ye therefore see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand, and let him which is in Judea flee into the mountains. And so in the middle of that week of 7 years, and there's a 75-day, my understanding of it is that there's a 75-day period tacked on to the second half. And we've talked about that here. A couple of years ago, I did a teaching on that on a future Hanukkah. And I won't go into why I think that, but in the middle of that week, the Antichrist goes into the temple that exists, and it may be part of this Palestinian agreement is, okay, look, we'll get you a temple. Because that's really what the Orthodox Jews, a lot of them really want, is that temple. And they want peace. So this man of peace will come on the scene, and he'll dupe everybody into believing that he has the solution. And for a time, I think it'll look like, hey, he was right. And anybody running around saying that, hey, watch out, look out, don't pay attention, don't believe what this guy's saying, you're going to be, whoever's doing it, you're going to be persecuted. You're going to be run down. They're going to try to shut you up. So we know that that's going to happen. So, and the Daniel says, and Jesus makes reference to Daniel, and then you go back to Daniel 9:27 and say, okay, when is this going to occur? Daniel says in the midst of the week. And we know that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, it also talks about how you identify the Antichrist. Now, it's possible that you might be able to identify the Antichrist because of this peace agreement. Maybe not, though, because it says there are a lot of Antichrists in the world. And so maybe it won't be the public event that we think, but ultimately, at least my understanding of 2 Thessalonians 2 is that the way to identify the Antichrist is the one who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God. And we know that at the middle of that week, there's also a war in heaven that takes place. What's going on in the spiritual realm manifests itself out on earth. We talked about the prince of Persia, prince of other countries, these demonic entities that are in charge or seem to have influence over these areas. And there's a war in heaven, and Satan is cast down out of heaven. And when that happens, Satan knows his time is limited. He knows the timeline or the chart better than anybody. And so he's going to make one push to destroy the Jewish people. And it says that happens at the beginning of the week. And Jesus describes it himself as, for then shall be great tribulation. It happens after the midpoint, not before, after the midpoint. Don't argue with me about when it starts. Argue with Jesus, because he's the one who said, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, these days will be shortened. In Jeremiah chapter 30, it also talks about this time that's identified. For lo, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will bring again the captivity of my people Israel and Judah, saith the Lord, and I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. And these are the words of the Lord that the Lord spake concerning Israel and concerning Judah. For thus saith the Lord, we have heard a voice of trembling, of fear, and not of peace. Ask ye now, and see whether a man doth travail with child. Wherefore do I see every man with his hands on his loins as a woman in travail, and all faces are turned into paleness. Alas, for that day is great, similar to what Jesus said about the beginning of the Great Tribulation. For that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. So we see these parallel passages in Jeremiah 30 and Matthew chapter 24, sort of identifying when this time of Jacob's trouble is, the time of great tribulation. Well, in response to Ban Ki-moon, so that's sort of the biblical context to lay out how all of these things might unfold. There were a lot of other reports this week. Netanyahu responded to Ban Ki-moon. You can see in the upper left-hand corner, it was reported, says UN Chief Ban is giving terror a tailwind. This is what Netanyahu had to say. The UN Secretary General's remarks, it's in Hebrew, so just keep the sound down. Let me start this over again. Okay, the UN Secretary General's remarks give a tailwind to terrorism, he says. There is no justification for terrorism, period. The Palestinian murderers do not want to build a state. They want to destroy a state, and they say this openly. They want to murder Jews simply because they are Jews, and they say this openly. They do not murder for peace, and they do not murder for human rights. The UN lost its neutrality and moral force a long time ago, and the Secretary General's remarks do not improve the situation. And that was Netanyahu's rather direct response. Now, Ban Ki-moon responded back and said, hey, we're not accepting it. At the same time this was going on in the United States on Holocaust Remembrance Day, President Obama went to the Holocaust Museum, and he spoke about it, and his response essentially was, hey, well, I'll put it in context in just a minute, what he said actually. But there was also a report that came out, a column, an opinion column in the Wall Street Journal the other day called The Humbling of the West. And it talked about certain things that had happened that week, that were historically significant about the West. Some wonder, this is Dan Henninger's column, some wonder how history will treat Barack Obama's presidency. That depends on who writes the histories. Secretary of State John Kerry's account will fist pump the Iran nuclear deal as the central foreign policy event of the Obama presidency, a triumph for Western diplomacy. But news photographs in recent weeks are producing a different history. These photos document the abject humiliation of the West by Iran. Americans who plan to vote in their presidential election should look hard at these photos, because the West's direction after this will turn on the decisions that they make. The first photo is in a hallway of the Rome's Capitoline Museums, a repository of art dating to the Western antiquity. Out of what the government of Italy called respect for the sensibilities of visiting Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. By the way, Rouhani met with the Pope and the Italian guy the day before International Holocaust Remembrance Day. A country that says Israel should be wiped out. The head of that country, the political head, not the supreme leader, but the political head, with the blessing of the supreme leader, was it going around sort of making business deals because now it's fine for Iran to make business deals again. Out of the government of Italy called respect for the sensibilities of visiting President Hassan Rouhani, the museum placed large white boxes over several nude sculptures, including a Venus created in the 2nd century BC. So here is the museum in Rome, and this is what they did to make it comfortable for the Iranian president. And you can see the head of one of the marble statues sticking up over the thing. They actually did this this week. Then, because Mr. Rouhani will not attend a meal that serves alcohol to anyone, the nominally Italian government of Prime Minister Matteo Renzi declined to serve wine. They did so for the same reason that beggars grub change in front of Rome's churches. Freed by the Obama nuclear deal with Iran, Italy's 10-cup businesses signed about a dozen deals with Mr. Rouhani this week, totaling $18 billion. The bowing and scraping to Mr. Rouhani continues this week as France and Germany sign more deals. This is not economic renormalization. Rather than reform its weak, politically unstable economies, Europe is content to make itself a dependency of the aborting Iranian government. The second photo of Western submission depicts what appears to be a glee-filled meeting between the president of Iran and the leader of the world's Catholics, Pope Francis, who gave Mr. Rouhani 40 minutes of his time. The Vatican argues that this is realpolitik by a pope trying to protect Christians in the Middle East by inducing Iran to play an important role in the peace process. Do you see how this push for peace is going on at many, many different levels? And here's a picture of Rouhani and the Pope at the Vatican. They went in this meeting. They talked about what a great partnership that they were going to have between the two. And they stood there. And it's a stunning sight to see this leader of the greatest state sponsor of terrorism in the world being accepted everywhere. And John Allen, who writes for The Crux, Considering All Things Catholic, a magazine, said the bond between the Vatican and Iran is a partnership destined to endure. Look what he says. If Italian media reports are to be believed, Rouhani may have presented Francis with a formal invitation to make an historic visit to Iran, perhaps as early as May, when the pontiff is also considering a trip to Armenia. Not so long ago, when Iran's ambitions to become a nuclear power still posed real questions about global security, such an outing would have been problematic, especially for a peace pope. Last year's framework agreement with the P5+1 powers, however, has made it more thinkable. You see the shift and change that's happened? And so what Dan Henninger is saying is, I'm sure Dan Henninger is looking at this and thinking about, remember the humiliation of the hostage thing every night on Nightline with Ted Kopp? That's why that program started. 444 days, every night we're reminded that the American hostages are still in Iran. At one level, the close ties between Rome and Tehran reflect the often underappreciated fact, this is a Catholic writer, the often underappreciated fact that both the Vatican and post-revolutionary Iran are basically theocracies representing spiritual traditions, Catholicism and Shia Islam, that have a surprising amount in common. And then he goes and lays out in his article all the similarities that they have. This is one of the main writers for Catholicism in the world, saying that, there's really not that much difference between Islam and Catholicism. I think you need to think about this and grasp how important stuff like this is when it happens. This is really, it seems to be unprecedented. Strong emphasis on clerical authority, approach to the Quran accenting both scripture and tradition, a deep mystical streak. Sounds like the emergent church can go on with this. Well, you saw the article from the guy in the Huffington Post saying, hey, we can accept Muhammad as a prophet and still be Christians. And so all of this stuff, all of these things, the push for a one-world religion, the push for peace in the Middle East, the push for a one-world government, the push to build a better man, on and on and on, the breakdown in moral clarity, the breakdown in clear thinking, the belief that government will solve all the problems in the world, the lack of responsibility of the individual. All of these things are converging at the same time, really at breakneck speed. It says here, the similarity is the theology of sacrifice and atonement. How can a Catholic, well, it's not surprising to me that a Catholic could say that, because Catholicism really believes in a religion of works, not in the atonement of Jesus Christ finished once for all on the cross. But, hey, we're just like Muslims. And here we have, this is the guy writing for the Vatican. Set aside the role that Iran has played in the death of 250,000 Syrians, Henninger continues, and the refugees now destabilizing Europe. One may still ask, why such public and jolly photo ops with this person? The U.S. State Department Religious Freedom Report says in 2014, Iran executed at least 24 individuals for the crime of enmity against God, and surely that understates the total killed. The persecuted in Iran include Baha'is, Sunni Muslims, Christians, notably evangelicals, Jews, Yersanis, and even Shia groups. Mr. Rouhani is grinning in this photo because he knows these people can't move Iran's culture out of the 16th century. He then said the third thing was, so the first thing was the museum, second thing was the meeting with the Pope, third thing was these pictures of our soldiers, including a female soldier who was made to wear a hijab. One has attempted to tip one's hat to the Khomeini-Rouhani strategy team. Iran took the West measure with its nuclear brinkmanship, and the West bent. Some may say the Italians are the Italians. The Pope has his reasons, and Barack Obama and John Kerry are just finishing their apology tour. But that understates the long series of political compromises and cultural surrenders that have brought the U.S. and Europe to this point. That's a great article. And then Obama, I'm not going to play his comments at the Holocaust Museum, but one of the things that he did not mention in that speech was he did not mention Iran, he did not mention radical Islam. He refused to talk about them. So, also this report, Obama isn't letting the prime minister get in his way of his commitment to the Jews in Israel. This is a left-wing newspaper in Israel that says Obama's fine. There's no problem with how he treats Israel. Interesting thing that came out this week too about, we talked about BDS, boycott, divest, and sanctions. Our Department of Commerce has now issued, sort of picked up old regulations that say this: pursuant to the request of the Department of State, this document notifies the public that acceptable countries of origin markings for goods produced in the territorial areas known as the West Bank or Gaza Strip consist of the following: West Bank/Gaza, West Bank/Gaza Strip, West Bank and Gaza, West Bank and Gaza Strip, West Bank, Gaza, Gaza Strip. The position stated in this document is effective for merchandise which is entered or withdrawn from warehouse for consumption on or after the date of publication in the Federal Register. And this U.S. Customs and Border Protection thing came out this week to say it is not acceptable to mark the aforementioned goods with the words Israel, made in Israel, occupied territories Israel, or any variation thereof. Goods that are erroneously marked, this is our Customs Department of the United States, goods that are erroneously marked as products of Israel will be subject to an enforcement action carried out by U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Now that we're going to enforce. People coming across the border, well, that's more difficult because, you know, this is okay because it's Jews. It's Jews. It's okay. Other stuff we have to let go by. Goods entering the United States must conform to the U.S. marking statute and regulations promulgated thereunder. At the same time, France is saying that, look, we're going to recognize Palestinian state if talks and deadlock persist. France warned Friday that it will recognize the Palestinian state and if its imminent efforts to end the deadlock and peace talks between Israelis and Palestinians end without result. France will engage in the coming weeks in the preparation of an international conference bringing together the parties and their main partners, American, European, Arab, notably to preserve and make happen the solution of two states. Am I understating or overstating the push for the two-state solution? Israel rejected this ultimatum. This is not how one makes peace. All I'm saying is that there is this push on Israel to make peace. Israel moved quickly Friday to reject what it sees as a new French ultimatum on recognition of a Palestinian state. the French foreign minister said this, and what will happen if this last-ditch attempt at reaching a negotiated solution hits a stumbling block? In that case, we will have to live up to our responsibilities and recognize a Palestinian state. Israel rejected the approach. This is not how one conducts negotiations and not how one makes peace, an Israeli official was quoted by the Hebrew daily Haaretz as saying. So there's this push to do this. And again, there will be this push to give them this area of the mountains of Israel. Read Ezekiel 35 and 36. I believe it talks about it. I probably have a very minority view of that, but nevertheless, that's my view. I'll finish with this Caroline Glick talking about her column in Friday's Jerusalem Post saying, hope is not a strategy. She concludes with this. The lesson from these miserable experiences is clear enough. Since Israel is going to be attacked no matter what it does, we might as well do the things that advance our interests. In other words, she's saying is, okay, the labeling of products, the push for peace. She said, don't let the settlements grow. Don't let people have children there. Get the Jews out of the Palestinian areas. Because, we can have Arabs in Israel, but we can't have Jews in the Palestinian areas. Since we will be vilified for building settlements, even when the government freezes construction, we might as well build settlements. Since the price for expanding existing buildings is the same as the price for building new neighborhoods and communities, there is no reason to pay full price for a fraction of the benefit. Indeed, since the Obama administration and the EU plan to attack us no matter what we do, we might as well go ahead and apply Israeli law to the Jordan Valley and Gush Etzion. Likewise, since the same forces will viciously condemn us for advancing legislation that will do nothing to curb their funding for Israeli agents or curtail the hostile actions of those agents, we might as well get viciously attacked for doing something to curb their funding and curtail their actions. Given the ferocity of the criticism Israel is enduring over the Shakid bill, that's the bill to make NGOs in Israel say where their funding is coming from, it makes sense to redraft the bill and turn it into something useful. We get it. The Obama administration and the EU aren't attacking Israel because we did something wrong. They're attacking us because they want to hurt us. That is their goal. Recognizing this sorry truth, the public elected the Likud and its coalition partners to defend our interests and our rights. Hope is not a strategy. Building new communities and neighborhoods, expanding the writ of Israeli law, and curtailing the activities of subversive foreign agents is a strategy, and a good one. And I wish more people felt that way. Unfortunately, as I read the prophetic scriptures, I think that eventually Israel will give in to this pressure. And the pressure will only continue to increase in the days, weeks, and months ahead. It might have little blips here and there where it seems to be backing off, but I just see this as I think this is the way the scripture says it's going to go. And all the signs that I look for, all the news, all the reports, the geopolitical reports, analysis, all of them are pushing for this peace between Israel and Palestine. And we know it's not bad. We know, I agree with Isaiah 28, it's a covenant with death. It will be a covenant with death and hell. Now, ultimately, at the end, there's a glorious revival among the Jews that survived to the end. But a lot of trouble between now and then. So, Jesus said, when you see all these things, look up. Okay, let's pray. Father, again, thanks so much for your prophetic word and the things that you have allowed your prophets to tell us centuries, even millennia ago, that help us understand the world in which we live today. And Lord, we pray that we will take that proof that your prophets did know of which they spoke, and that we will use it as a motivation to rescue as many people as we can from an eternity separated from you. Bless us as we go this week. In Jesus' name, amen.